Is Davos the new church of Calvinism? What is Calvinism? Or let's start out, what is Davos? I'm calling Davos the morbidly rich support group, the biannual meeting or semi-annual, whichever one is twice a year, in Davos, Switzerland, of the morbidly rich. Yesterday, Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema were high-fiving each other over their success in blocking voting rights legislation and blocking any kind of changes to the tax code that might have done away with, in particular, a massive multi-billion-dollar tax loophole that allows Wall Street bankers and hedge funds and private equity managers to make billions and not pay the taxes on it that you or I would have to if we had that kind of income. They were high-fiving. But as I point out, there's a lot more high to that high five than the media was reporting. And that is that science shows that acquiring wealth actually stimulates a part of the brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that is the part of our brain that, it's just behind your eyes, that lights up when you are presented with it's kind of the reward center of the brain. You're presented with sex, you're presented with food, you're presented with money. Oh boy, right? It's that response. And this is something that, we've known forever, right? Paul wrote to Timothy, for the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have pierced themselves through with many sorrows. We've known this forever. But here in the United States, we tend to go back and forth, and frankly, it appears to me that we go back and forth in these 40-year cycles, which I find absolutely fascinating, the kind of half of the 80-year cycles that we've talked about before, the Strauss and Howe cycles. And, we go loving money for 40 years, and then we realize that the people who are obsessively loving money are ruining the country, and then we get wary of people who are, of greed, for 40 years, and we flip back and forth, and I think we're flipping into the new one. But this is actually a crisis for our society, this worshiping of wealth. We train our children to worship wealth. Cinderella was desperate to marry a wealthy prince, right? Brave knights served their feudal lords and kings. Jack climbed the beanstalk and risked his life to steal a giant bag of gold coins. We're also trained in some of our religions to defer to great wealth. Calvinism is the most conspicuous of these, and the followers of John Calvin are big fans of that quote from Ephesians, Paul's letter to the Ephesians, in which he says that our fates were determined, quote, before the foundation of the world. And so, basically the Calvinist perspective on this is that if you try to figure out who should run a country, you're trying to figure, and you want it to be a godly person, a person blessed by God. You don't want it to be an evil person, you want it to be a good person. How do you determine who are the good people who are blessed by God? Well, according to John Calvin, if you are rich, that was determined before you were born. And it was determined by God as an outward sign of his blessing on you, right? And so, therefore, you should rule the country because obviously you're a good person because you're rich, and you're good because you're rich because you're good. It's circular logic, but this is where we're at. Now, we didn't always think this way. After the Republican Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt called out the rich in this country. Just explicitly and constantly. I play these clips all the time. I won't play any today, but he just, talked about the economic royalists and I think one of my favorite quotes, he said, "These economic royalists complain that we seek to overthrow the institutions of America. What they really complain of is that we seek to take away their power. And our allegiance to American institutions requires the overthrow of this kind of power." Yeah. And the people got a standing ovation in 1936 when he said that. So, but in 1980, we had this foundational shift in America, just at the core of our society, a shift in our worldview. And we refer to this period as the Reagan Revolution, but it was a fact. Many of us lived through this, and you look back on it. In the 50s and 60s, you had television programs like the Lucille Ball show, right? Or Jackie Gleason or whatever. They lived in these kind of low rent apartments, small apartments in New York City. Then in the 70s, the Mary Tyler Moore Show. She lived in Minneapolis. Again, in a just modest middle-class apartment. Dick Van Dyke Show, same thing in New Rochelle. But then in 1981, as Ronald Reagan became president, television changed. It really changed substantially. They rolled out Dynasty. Suddenly we had all these shows about wealthy, powerful people, lionizing great wealth. And it was like the zeitgeist of the time. The biggest movie of the entire decade was Wall Street, in which Michael Douglas said, greed is good, famously. Greed is good. It was the mantra of that time. And so we went from worshiping the rich in the 1920s, which led right to the crash, to being wary of the rich from the 1930s to the 1980s, to worshiping the rich again from the 1980s up until just the last year or two, I would say. In fact, we elected a billionaire as president, or a guy who claims he's a billionaire. And now I think, frankly, America is starting to switch back to being wary of the morbidly rich anyway. And the point that I make at the end of the story and the end of the article is that this is how social, political, and even cultural change happens, is that worldviews are like viruses. They're contagious. They spread in response to circumstances and opportunity. Every one of us is a carrier of this worldview virus. And that's how change happens. A small number of people wake up, they share their new understanding with others, it spreads across society, society recalibrates its consensus about reality, and finally things change. Which is why it's so vital at this particular hinge point of history that each one of us work within our own circles of friends and neighbors and acquaintances to wake people up to both the crises and the opportunities before us.